In the previous three lessons, we've been talking about the three certainties. We began, should I say, by talking about the certainty of intention. We then followed this on by looking at the certainty of subject matter. And then finally, we talked about the certainty of objects. The three of these referring to, of course, this idea of there being an expressed intention required for the creation of a fixed trust, or at least an express trust. The clear property has to be outlined in terms of what is and what isn't part of the trust in terms of property. That represents the certainty of subject matter. And then finally, there is, of course, the certainty of objects, who may be beneficiaries of the trusts. This lesson is going to talk about a little bit more about the certainty of objects specifically, and focus on this idea of the fixed trust versus the discretionary trust. We'll talk about the fixed trust in this lesson, and then we'll talk about the discretionary one in the next, because ultimately, we made it clear that in the certainty of objects, there is a requirement of the existence of beneficiaries, and that there has to be a certain amount of conceptual certainty as to whom is and who isn't a beneficiary. We're going to talk about the application of the certainty of objects in this lesson with reference to this idea of the fixed trust. So, to begin with, let's think about what the fixed trust is, because we have talked about this earlier on in very early lessons on the law of trusts, talking about the different types of trust that exist. But essentially, a fixed trust is one in which the property and the beneficiaries and the distribution of said property is clearly defined. Okay, so when it comes to establishing the certainty of objects, specifically for a fixed trust, the general rule is that a fixed trust requires clearly ascertainable beneficiaries. So if I was a settler and I wanted to put some money on trust for whoever, for a beneficiary, okay, I would have a clear amount of money that I'm giving to a trustee, and that trustee is going to hold that property on trust for this beneficiary or beneficiaries, and there is a clear delineation as to how that property is going to be distributed, what is going to be done with that property. All the trustee has to do, essentially, is hold on to it, keep it, don't do anything with it, don't mess it up, and allow for that property to then be retained by the beneficiaries on trust as and when they so choose, or maybe even after a period of 10 years, for example. All of this would represent something of a fixed trust. And given this, the general rule, as I've said and as stated here, is that there has to be clearly ascertainable beneficiaries. There must be what is known as a complete list of beneficiaries, as we noted in the previous lesson. Now, one of the interesting cases here is this case here from OT Computers Limited and First National Tricity Finance Limited from 2003. Ultimately, in this case, the claimants had been the retailer of a number of computer products in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2002, there was an instruction by the claimant to their bank for the creation of two trust accounts. They made two lists. They made a list of customers, and they then made a list of suppliers, following it so far. When the bank sought to discharge these accounts, it was taken to court, and it was held that with the customers, it was held that there was a trust that had existed. But the supplier's account failed to create a trust owing to a lack of certainty of objects, because this was an account which was titled, quote, urgent suppliers, and it was held that the word urgent created uncertainty in the complete list test, and therefore was unable to be drawn up. Because I could have a list of suppliers, and if it was just a list of suppliers full stop, and it was just every single person who has been a supplier for my company, whatever, for the duration of my trading, okay, this would be a conceptually certain identifiable list of beneficiaries, and therefore constitute certainty of objects. But the fact that they had a caveat, essentially, which was not just all the suppliers, but only the urgent suppliers. Well, what counts as urgent? who defines what urgent may be. For some people, urgent suppliers might be this list of suppliers over here, but for other people, urgent suppliers might be this list of suppliers over here. Where is the line drawn? This is where the conceptual uncertainty is created, and therefore the complete list is unable to be drawn up. So there was a complete list of suppliers, which is fine, in the same way that there was a complete list of customers, okay? But they didn't have a trust which defined the beneficiaries as just being suppliers. They had a trust which defined the beneficiaries as being urgent suppliers, which is therefore not a trust because there cannot be certainty of objects. Finally then, when we talk about fixed trust, there's one issue here when we talk about certainty and uncertainty. We've focused on the idea of conceptual certainty, the idea of a list being conceptually certain or uncertain, as to essentially clearly delimit where the trust instrument begins and ends, essentially. But what about the difference between conceptual and evidential certainty? Well, the idea of evidential certainty is required only for the creation of the expressed fixed trust. And the reason for this is because a trust could fail on the basis of evidential uncertainty, because that there may be an impossibility in the acquisition of information pertaining to who the beneficiary is. So a trust instrument may be completely conceptually certain in being able to clearly define the class of beneficiaries, okay? And there is no conceptual uncertainty there at all. But then when it comes to actually applying and implementing the trust instrument, it could be the case that, well, we have conceptual certainty. We know this list is a complete list. It fits the complete list test, but it doesn't quite fit the test for evidential certainty, because it still may be impossible to have an acquisition of information. The case example from Haley and McCurdy from page 81 specifically is that, for example, if we were to have the beneficiaries of the trust be a complete list of first-class graduates from the University of Lincoln in 1967, okay, that would represent a complete list. We can clearly ascertain who is and who isn't a member of that class. It is anybody who graduated from the University of Lincoln, for example, in 1967, and who got a first-class degree. Easy. But then what if that list was destroyed in a fire in 1969, okay? Well, we have a complete list, because we can say, well, who are the beneficiaries? Well, it's every first-class graduate from the University of Lincoln in 1967. Oh, great, complete list, certainty of objects. Okay, then let's start going about implementing the trust. Okay, let's start ringing up every single first-class graduate from the University of Lincoln in 1967. Let's find them. Oh, there is the list itself was destroyed in a fire. Oh, well, it's impossible to acquire the information of who are the first-class graduates from the University of Lincoln in 1967. This is what we mean by evidential uncertainty. And this is really where we see that there is a sufficient amount of conceptual certainty, but there is no evidential certainty because we don't know who makes up that class, because we lost the list, for example. And so it has to be very clearly delimited between this idea of there being a conceptual list, a complete list that is conceptually certain, but that it's still impossible to execute the trust on the basis of there being an impossibility of acquisition of information pertaining to who may be a beneficiary.